Welcome, everybody. This evening, we are getting ready to do an impromptu prophecy update, a special edition. I'm really excited about this. In a minute, we're going to have Steve, the tour guide, come on and join us. It's going to be outstanding, as it always is. But I'd like to start with a word of prayer. So let's go ahead and pray. And Lord, we are thankful this evening for a chance just to consider your word as it relates to what's going on around us. Lord, I'm thankful that you're not the author of confusion. But you give us clarity in the scripture, Lord. We're so thankful for that, and pray that you'd guide our conversation and the topics we cover this evening, Lord. We pray blessing now in Jesus' name. Amen. Yes. So tonight, we'll be looking at developments from Israel, Gaza, Iran, Yemen, Syria, all set really against the backdrop of President Trump's controversial, as it's becoming, his Middle East visit. I'm reminded, just when I think about these things, I'm reminded of Zechariah chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, where it says, "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all people round about, when they shall be in the siege, both against Judah, against Jerusalem. And in that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered against it." One of the things that I watch when I watch, Israel being put on a back burner or Israel being treated badly is just the footsteps toward this time in Zechariah that I believe is going to usher in the second coming of Christ. So we're not there yet. But these are things that I just kind of watch. Zechariah 14:2, the Lord says, "I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle." That's what's going to happen. So I always kind of look through that lens. Are nations warming up to Israel? Are they becoming more enemies? Are we being set up for a potential dangerous place for Israel? Because like Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 14 says, "They have, healed also the hurt of the daughter of my people slightly, saying, peace, peace, when there really is no peace." I do wonder, about this trip that Trump has made, because people are saying, wow, is he going to, add to the Abraham Accords? Is there going to be peace? Or are we setting ourselves up for trouble? There's a lot to talk about. And so it's for that reason I thought, what a good chance for us to tap into Steve, the tour guide. Good friend of mine, spent a lot of his life in Jerusalem, living in Israel as a tour guide, but a real scholar and a good friend. I'm thankful. Steve, I'd like to welcome you to our program tonight.
Thanks for having me, Pastor Brett and Athey Creek.
Yes, the whole crew is here tonight. We're only online tonight, but nobody's in the sanctuary, so this is kind of an impromptu deal. So a lot of good stuff to talk about. Have you been following everything that's been going on?
Oh, yeah. Especially for the last, I would say the last 10 days, there's been a lot going on. So a lot to draw one to the news cycles, that's for sure.
Yeah. I'd like to start with a question, and maybe this is a broad one, and we'll zero in on some of the more specifics, but, what strategic surprises have been placed on Israel in relation to Trump's Middle East visit? I know the United States are a little shocked how we seem to have given Netanyahu the cold shoulder. We're sort of unilaterally going into these meetings. What is the average Israeli? What is Benjamin Netanyahu thinking right now about Trump's Middle East visit? What's your thought on that?
So there's no doubt that Trump is circumventing Netanyahu and not even consulting with Netanyahu on any of these moves. And therefore, every one of these moves, starting with the release of the hostage, Adon Alexander, a few days ago, actually before that, Brett, the deal with the Houthis, that would end American strikes. Now, we have to be careful to separate the noise from the substance. So, and the Houthis are a great example of how one must separate. So Israel was very disappointed with Trump's deal with the Houthis, but in hindsight, they really had no reason to be upset, because the American intervention with the Houthis was never declared from the get-go to be an assist to Israel. It was always about safeguarding shipping through the Red Sea. It was a very limited operation in its goals, and the goal was met, evidently. In other words, the Trump administration negotiated a cessation of Houthi aiming at American ships and let's say European ships, okay, allied ships that were responsible. Let's not forget the Red Sea is responsible for something like 5%, maybe a little bit more of all the world's commerce goes through there. So that was always from the get-go very limited operation, and those aims were met. In other words, Israel, it's being said, and probably with some truth, it's probably correct that Israel should not have felt dissed by President Trump on that issue, because Israel was never a factor in America's entering that issue with the Houthis, bombing the Houthis. Now, obviously, Israel loved, and I get it that it was bombing the Houthis, that America got involved in all that. But from the get-go, it was never promised to be an assist to Israel on that issue. So this is what I mean when we had to use the Houthis as an example of where the real substance is, where the truth is, and where the rumors of the backstab are. At least as it relates to that one issue, no backstab. It's true that they likely circumvented Israel entirely, but it was always perceived by America to be a uniquely American operation.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wonder sometimes how much of the news I'm reading or hearing is just propaganda. But like one of the outlets I read, Trump basically says you can keep bombing Israel, but don't, we'll make an agreement as long as American ships are safe. Then we don't care what you do to Israel. That was the way the propaganda was, but. My understanding, at 31 days, he wanted a report, basically. The president asked for a progress report. And after $1 billion, it showed that the U.S. was heading into an expensive and almost indefinite military campaign against the Houthis. So, I sort of get why he's saying, I don't want to. Trump seems to be a guy who doesn't want to get in long-term conflicts and stuff like that. But the concern for me was, is he leaving Israel in the dust, saying, yeah, you can keep bombing, the Houthis can keep bombing Israel? They've sent these ballistic missiles. Didn't you just have one hit just, was it
today?
Just today.
Yeah.
Today.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's crazy.
Sure. But, and again, this is just my own view of the conflict, in my own view of the way Israel is not correctly fighting this conflict with the Houthis. Iran is the real backer of the Houthis. Yeah. Every single attack on Israel emanates from Iran. The attack that happened against Israel last week on Ben Gurion Airport should have been responded to by Israel with an attack on Tehran's international airport. Yeah. Anybody with common sense in that part of the world knows that. But Netanyahu did not pursue that action. Instead, he hit the Yemen international airport, which, while again makes for good optics and it showed what Israel's capabilities are, that it was able to fly a longer distance to Yemen than it would require for it to fly to Iran. Yeah. Hitting Yemen's airport was the least risky of the two options. So look, when it comes to this war, one of the chief criticisms against Netanyahu, and I actually agree with this criticism, and it's come from many people, is that he should be hitting Iran. Iran's never been more vulnerable, and we're not talking about hitting Iran's nuclear facilities. We're talking about basically just a tit for tat, hitting Iran proportional to what the Houthis do to Israel. Because as soon as Iran tells the Houthis to stop, they will stop. The Houthis are a proxy of Iran. So the real question is, why isn't Netanyahu attacking Iran directly? Now, some people in the media in Israel say because Trump would consider this to be interfering with the American negotiations over, Iran's nuclear program. But I don't think that it would be interpreted as such. And I don't think, and I haven't read that the Trump administration has told Netanyahu, don't you dare attack, Iran, aside from the nuclear facilities there. So that's the question here. The management of the war itself, which has already gone on for something like 18 months plus, is the war being conducted properly right now? And as it relates to the proxy wars, I'm not talking about Hamas right now. That's another issue, which I'm sure you and I will get into. But as it relates to the whole proxy thing, no, the it's just a sound and light show what Israel does to Yemen. It doesn't have any chance. Let's just draw this line in the proverbial Middle Eastern sand right now. There's not a single thing Israel will do or can do to stop the Houthis by attacking Yemen itself. So whatever it does by attacking Yemen is strictly a sound and light show for domestic, wow, look at what we did. To really win the war and end this whole thing with the Houthis, they have to go after Iran. And that's what would bring this to an end real quickly.
Because do you think that's just because of the funding? Houthis need money and weapons, and they wouldn't have
It's more
that.
than that. Wait to hear this. The Houthis have a ship sailing on. The Houthis get their intelligence from an Iranian intelligence ship, that's just off their coast, an island off their coast, right by an island. Iran has a spy ship that nobody hits. Why is that thing still around? And it has other intelligence means that it shares with them. It's the one supplying a lot of their weapons. Like you said, it supplies their money. It's a multi-fronted assistance of
Yeah,
Iran to the Houthis. Without
yeah.
Iran, the Houthis would not be. I'm telling you, if Iran were to tell them stop immediately, cease and desist immediately, they would. They're not an independent actor, the Houthis.
Yeah, because I have to say, just watching from a distance, the Houthis do seem formidable. I mean, the United States, we were not successful in our campaign, whatever you want to call it, for the past 31 days. And like the Times of Israel article said, how a floundering U.S. campaign against the Houthis reportedly led Trump to a truce. Would you say that title is correct?
So look, it's not like let's say this. I wouldn't say that the Houthis have great capabilities other than, these ballistic missiles, which are pretty good capability.
Yeah,
What it is, and what Trump acknowledges that the Houthis can take a beating and keep on ticking. If you remember the energy, what was it? The battery company, takes a licking and keeps on ticking. The Houthis are a fourth world. They're not used to living at the luxury life standards that we in America or Europe do. In other words, they have a capacity to take a beating because they're already living one step away from the Stone Age. There's nothing to be impressed about by Houthi society, or Yemen society. So that's what Trump was saying. In other words, they're durable because they can take a beating. It seems like they're willing to lose substance, material, buildings, stuff like that. And look, as you know, to the extent that these people are Islamic fundamentalists, they're willing to be martyrs too. Now, I'm not sure how many lives these American attacks took. It seems like the playbook for both America and Israel is to reduce casualties, to go after
yeah,
hardware like ports or arms caches. It's not like they were killing a lot of people.
yeah.
So that's what Trump meant. It's true. What else could America do to bring the Houthis to their knees? Not much, and even Israel's taking out of their international airport, like I said. It's just a nuisance to them, whereas
Yeah.
to us, if somebody took out Newark Airport, although it seems to be taking itself out, with this old equipment, if you've kept up with the news, of what's going on with the airports in this country, where the equipment is failing and there's blackouts between the control tower and the airplanes, that would be a big deal to us,
Yeah.
to our economy if somebody took out our main airport. But when you're living already close to ground zero, or let's say the bottom of the a bucket, it's true. You have little leverage with them.
Yeah.
So, and this is again why I say that the real address for any response should be Iran. And in my opinion, Israel is blowing it, and they've blown it since they took out Iran's air defenses. At that point, they cleared the way for all future attacks, and Israel has never taken advantage of it since.
Well, that maybe is a good segue into that. Why do you think that Israel hasn't taken advantage? Do you think it's the world view of
No.
what's the problem?
The problem, again, and I'm just being fair, and this is consistent with my not being a cheerleader of any politician. Even though I voted for Netanyahu in every election he ran in, except for the one immediately before the October 7 terror attack, because I saw the writing on the wall that he was causing risk to Israel by things that he was doing before that attack. Okay, but I'm prefacing my answer so that the people who are watching this will say, "Well, Steve is obviously not some knee-jerk anti-Netanyahu person." Okay, I voted for him in all of his elections but one, and yet I say that there's a lot of criticism against him that's been going on for the last 20 years. It says he's not decisive. He doesn't he doesn't have, I don't like to use the word guts. It's like he's proved his mettle in war. He's been wounded in war, and his family has paid a price in past wars and military operations. It's not like I'm accusing him of being a wimp, okay? But he seems to lack decisiveness when he arrives to major or critical junctures. Now, a key example of this is on October 11, 2023, when his defense minister begged him to do the pager attack. I'm not sure people know this, but Israel had a chance to do the attack with the pagers and walkie-talkies the previous year, and it would have killed 15,000 people instead of wounding approximately 1,500 to 2,000, which is what it did. Now, you and I are super impressed with that pager attack. Man, look at the pager attack.
Yeah.
It took out something like 1,800 Hezbollah people. But if it would have been done back on October 11, 2023, when the defense minister begged Netanyahu to do it, it would have killed 15,000, not just wounded 2,000. Why? Because the primary piece of equipment that Israel booby-trapped were actually walkie-talkies, not pagers.
Yeah.
And the walkie-talkies were in the hands of 15,000 Hezbollah people. And it was after that missed opportunity, Hezbollah began to retire the walkie-talkies and replace them with the pagers that became famous in the later iteration of that attack.
Yeah.
So that's an example of Netanyahu being presented with and by the way, that October 11 attack not only would have been so much larger in scale, it would have totally changed the direction of the war for the next 18 months. It's very possible that the war would have ended with Gaza, with Hamas, would have ended within just a few months had Israel done that. Because one of the things that Sinwar was holding on to for hope was that both Iran and Hezbollah were going to go all in at some point during this war and rescue him and save him and, open a full multi-front war with Israel. They never did that. But if Israel would have attacked them early,
Yeah.
then there would have been no illusion of it even being possible. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but wouldn't you say hindsight's 2020? I mean, it's easy for us to maybe suggest that Netanyahu should have pulled the trigger on that, but what couldn't you argue? He successfully got rid of all of Iran's air defenses, got rid of Hezbollah for the most part. Gaza is still a problem in Hamas, but some would argue what he's done this past year has been impressive. What do you say about that?
The country, including him, has done impressive things. But if I only had that one example of October 11, 2023, you could say, or I could say, yeah, you're right, Brett. Hindsight's 2020. But there's many examples. He had a chance to attack Iran when George Bush, the son, George W. Bush was president. Both he and his defense minister at the time, Ehud Barak, who happens to be the most decorated soldier in Israel's history, were ready to attack Iran then, and they didn't do it. So there's many examples of this happening, which is why it's become sort of a, what's the word, like a meme as it relates to Netanyahu, a theme, and it can't just easily be dismissed. It's not just his political opponents that have leveled that charge on him. It's even allies, or people are on the right too. So that's the problem. So look, again, that's true. I don't want to be an armchair general. And the last thing I would want to be is Prime Minister of Israel, which I think is the hardest job on the planet. But I'm just saying where there's smoke, there's fire, and that smoke of rumors for the last 10 to 20 years that he lacks decisiveness, in these type of critical moments, that smoke has existed for 10 to 20 years. And, there's a chance there's fire to that smoke, that there's some truth to it. But like you said, and remember, there's always the God factor,
Yeah.
since we are believers, but I do think, generally speaking, he's done a lot of correct decisions. But I do think the war's gone on a little too long, and there's been decisions of his that have helped prolong it, and it should start to be brought to a close.
Yeah. So back to Iran, then, you've stated that, he had opportunities to, really subdue Iran. Iran's in a weakened situation right now. And from some of the news I've heard, a top advisor to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Al Khamenei, said that the country is open to a nuclear deal with President Donald Trump if he sees, agrees to drop certain economic sanctions and what have you. Uh, is Trump's plan? Do you think it's just a version of Obama's nuclear deal with Iran? And what's going on there?
To an extent, and to answer that question, we need to address an issue, which is that since Donald Trump was elected, there is a civil war, if you will, within his own administration between two camps. And I'm not sure the names being used to address these two camps is really fair, okay? But I'll use the names that are being used. Neocons, okay? In other words, anyone that wants to attack Iran is a neocon, and again, and I'm not sure that's being fairly leveled in this context. The other term that's used usually in conservative politics is paleoconservatives, people with isolationist bent, that doesn't want to attack Iran or get involved in any foreign war. They're basically isolationists. And you have many people in his policy making cabinet, okay, who subscribe to that as well. So what happened was, leading up to all this, this is the backstory. The one who was most reportedly gung-ho for attacking Iran was his national security advisor, a guy by the name of Mike Waltz, who was fired a couple weeks ago for evidently having spoken, and this was the charge, this is the rumor, that the media is saying, that Netanyahu saw him as sort of like the weak man in the administration to try to apply the pressure on Donald Trump to attack Iran, as opposed to Tulsi Gabbard, and others in that administration that are very much against that. Now, one of the people that was against attacking Iran, and it actually surprised me, was Pete Hegseth, okay? Because if you would have asked me previous to this
Yeah.
last couple of weeks, I would have said that Hegseth is probably like, Mike Waltz, okay, very much for hitting Iran. But based on leaks about cabinet meetings, basically Hegseth was in agreement with Tulsi Gabbard not to attack now, to pursue diplomacy. So Waltz was fired. Marco Rubio is the temporary replacement for him. He now holds the two portfolios as Secretary of State and this temporary national security advisor. And now there's no one left that is gung-ho about attacking Iran. The only other person I heard was for attacking Iran was the CENTCOM general, whose last name, I think, and I'm just going off the top of my head here off the cuff because I've only seen his name in print maybe two times. It's either Keeley or Keeney. Okay, it's one of those two names. So he also felt that they should, help Israel. Israel would be the main attacker. It's not like America would do the main attack, but America would provide Israel backup to do its own attack against Iran. So there was a civil war within the administration, and the people that won were the people that wanted to pursue diplomacy. And I'm not even saying that's wrong. I'm not saying that trying diplomacy first is wrong. I'm going to shock you, Brett, with what I'm about to say. And again, this just shows you I'm not in any echo chamber. I'm not partial to any camp. I disagreed with Netanyahu Netanyahu counseled, right? Not canceled. How do you say counseled? Sorry, counseled Trump in Trump first administration to do away with the Obama nuclear deal. It was Netanyahu that really pushed Trump to do that. I never fully agreed with Netanyahu that that deal was awful. Okay, because what it did do with that original deal under Obama, and I hope all the people watching this at Athey Creek don't jump on me and say, "Oh my gosh, he's saying positive about anything related to Obama." Again, guys, I'm not in any political camp. I'm cerebral here, and I'm just going by the facts. The agreement at the time would have totally shut down that entire nuclear program and shipped out all of its enriched uranium would have been shipped outside the country for a period of 10 years. So what was Netanyahu's problem with it? It was what's called the sunset clause, that at the end of the 10 years, Iran would basically go back to where it was before the deal happened. But many people in Israel, respectable people within the security establishment, not people you can just dismiss as left wingers, okay, said, look, this is a good deal because Israel doesn't have the ability yet militarily to take out Iran's nuclear. At the time, we're talking, how many years ago this was. Israel was not believed to have the ability to take out the nuclear stuff, to the point where Iran's defenses and underground, it moved everything underground by that time, because somebody may be watching this and saying, wait, I thought Steve said Israel was ready to attack under George W. Bush. So why is he saying they didn't have the ability to do it under Obama? And that's because between George W. Bush's term and Obama's term, Iran hardened all their targets. They moved everything underground. They dispersed everything around the country. Iran's a huge country, and they disseminated all this stuff to multiple locations. In other words, Iran did what it had to do to harden itself as a target. So when the deal was made, it was considered by a lot of people in Israel's establishment, other than Netanyahu, to actually be an okay deal. And I wasn't personally against it. If you would have asked me in a similar broadcast that we're doing now many years ago, at risk of being piled on for saying anything good that, Obama could have done, it wasn't such a bad deal. And what happened was, under Netanyahu's pressure, Trump jettisoned the deal, and then things got really bad because Iran then tripled, doubled, tripled, going on quadrupled at some point in the future. Its centrifuges, and now has enough enriched uranium for something like 8 bombs. Nobody can argue that we're in a better position than since Trump did away with that deal. Israel has been in more danger, you could argue, since that deal was jettisoned. So I know some of your people are going to be shocked that I'm saying this, but again, I'm just being academic here. I'm not being political, and hopefully people forgive me.
I saw that you moved your pro-Obama poster behind your on the wall there. You took that off the wall
That's
for this
funny.
program.
That's funny.
No. I kind of feel like my position on that is I think there was maybe good intentions, and there's a lot of skin in the game for Europeans, for Macron and France and all. I mean, there's nations that should be concerned about a nuclear Iran. But to me, the 10-year plan was kicking the can down the road.
Yes.
But also, we were at the same time the Obama administration was giving, millions and
10 billion,
billions
and that
of
was
dollars.
Awful.
Like I think that coupled with that's what made the Iran deal stink to a lot of Americans. We're like, why are we paying all this money to this terrorist spot? Our money's going to go right to the Houthis, to the Gaza Strip.
So
Hamas.
Can I modify my answer? I'm glad you reminded me of that. So I was only talking about the technical aspects of what the deal did to Iran's nuclear pursuit.
Yeah.
But you're right. The famous airplane, that had wooden
crates.
Pallets filled with crates. Oh, in fact, it's possible October 7 would never have happened without those pallets. So I'm glad you said that. And now I want to modify my answer. Should God forbid people think I'm about to whip out the pom-poms and start cheering Obama. No, that was awful, an awful aspect of the deal, without a doubt. But so I just want to say again, I was only talking about but that's going to be part of the Trump Obama 2.0 deal. It's not like, so let me ask you this. Now we have to ask ourselves, let's say Trump does make a deal with them.
Yeah.
They're not doing it for free. They expect to get something in return. And what's Iran demanding in return? They're demanding the immediate relief of sanctions against him. Basically, that same road. Now, I'm not saying that airplanes will, pull off from America with pallets of billions of dollars, but it's true that Iran will get all of its money flow back. All sanctions relief. It will get, to sell its oil unhindered. So it will become a wealthy regime again.
Do you think that they'll ever submit to inspections by, I don't trust the world agencies to be legitimate on inspections, but, Trump said, I think it was in Saudi Arabia, and let me read what he said. He said, I want to make a deal with Iran. I want to do something if possible, but for that to happen, they must stop sponsoring terror, halt its bloody proxy wars, and permanently, verifiably cease pursuit of nuclear weapons. That's what he said. I think he said that from the podium in
Wow, there's
Riyadh.
zero chance of that happening.
Steve, do you think Trump's sincere in wanting to make a nuclear deal with Iran, or what's his agenda? Do you think?
I think he's sincere, but I also think he's really showing us how deftly, not, deft, Deftly, skillfully, he's doing, what Trump's famous for, this whole art of the deal. And it will also, he's maybe doing it to some degree to mitigate it hitting him in the face should he have to attack Iran, to say, look, I bent over backwards to avoid this. Because again, remember that civil war going on, and it's not just in his administration. Unfortunately, there's a civil war going on within American
Yeah,
conservative circles.
that's true.
In the blogosphere and vlogosphere, it's like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens on
Yep.
one side of the camp, and the Ben Shapiros and the others on the other side of the
Mike
camp.
Huckabee and
Mike
others.
Huckabee and those guys. So I think I think I think it's right what Trump is doing. Again, I'm not against pursuing diplomacy at all. So if it works, but one way it may work, even if there is a military operation, is to again show the Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson audiences, hey, look, folks, I did my best to avoid it. I circumvented Netanyahu and everything I'm doing. Nobody can say I was controlled by him. And Iran still didn't play ball. So I decided in the end that it's also in the American interest, because in Iran with a nuclear tip ballistic missiles, a threat to the United States too. We're the great Satan. Remember that.
Right.
Israel's the
Yeah.
little Satan. So I think it's wise what he's doing. Again, but it won't come for free if he decides to go the peaceful route. It will come with the same enriching, and it's a shame because Iran's regime has never been as weak as it currently is. And what it will do is throw them a lifeline, and they'll see longevity.
Yeah.
Whereas you could argue they're on the tip of, failing as a regime and failing and falling. Such a deal will throw that regime a lifeline and keep them in power for years to come, likely. And that's, another downside of it, if you don't
Yeah.
want to see them, yes, in power.
Yeah, so that raises an interesting question. All the news that I'm seeing, some people are saying Trump's turned his back on
No,
Israel and forsaken
no.
Israel. Can you address that? Because, part of me wonders, is this the art of the deal? And I almost, maybe I'm conspiracy theory, but I almost can picture he and Netanyahu agreeing to distance themselves for just an optic, so that he can go and do what he needs to do with these kind of crazy world leaders, and make some deals. And then hopefully, I'm hoping that he still is going to treat Israel with respect and Netanyahu with respect. Do you think this is the art of the deal, or has he in any way, shape, or form turned his back on Israel? What's your thought?
Okay, so let's say this. Yes, I'll answer in all. Those were three questions in one, so I'm going to attack all three. Yes, it's the art of the deal. No, he's not betraying Israel, but yes, he's circumventing Netanyahu. And this is really important what I'm about to say. A few years ago, a book came out, and I highly recommend this book for anybody who's just interested in the history of the Abraham Accords, because it's considered to be the best work written on the Abraham Accords. It's written by a guy named Barak Ravid, okay? And he's sort of center left, but it really doesn't affect, it shouldn't affect, what I think of this book, because the book was hailed in Israel because during his writing of the book, he was granted by Trump a 2-hour one-on-one interview at Mar-a-Lago. And during that interview, Trump had a lot of negative things to say about Netanyahu. He does not like Netanyahu. At least that was the case when this book was being written between the two Trump terms. Okay, we're talking about Biden's now the president, Trump is in Mar-a-Lago, and this reporter is hosted by Trump for a 2-hour discussion about the Abraham Accords, about Gaza, about Israel. Trump loves Israel, but he can't stand Netanyahu. That's what comes out of this interview. And the text of the interview is there. The quotes are direct. It's not like the author. That's why I'm saying that the author can be trusted, even if he's identified as a center left person, because this is Trump in his own words. It's not being filtered, by the author. And Trump really did not care for Netanyahu. He considered him to be, in Trump's words, basically, Netanyahu is an ingrate. Netanyahu is intransigent. He won't play ball. I think one of the things that came across in that interview was that Trump would say, look, I am, the greatest president to Israel in Israel's history, in the history of America and Israel relations. And I did all those things, yes, as a friend to Israel, but I also expect Israel to be grateful and take risk for peace. That concerned me when I read that. And I remember I didn't discuss this with you in interviews, but I discussed this with you on the side,
Yeah.
just you and I talking. I said, pay attention to this book because it's the best insight I have on Trump's thinking as it relates to his motives behind, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. I'm not saying this was his only motive. A lot of it was, one of the things that Trump does is to go against what he perceives to be, long failed American policies, like not moving the embassy to Jerusalem or not, doing this or not doing that. A lot of it is always, sometimes the motive is to be antithetical to what previous administrations have done. But in the interview, it was clear that one of the things that Trump felt was that Israel should now take a chance for peace and make peace with the Palestinians. And that was important for me to see that. That told me what Trump really believes about. See, we have to remember, Brett, we can't fall for the belief that Trump is an evangelical, premillennial, rapture believing, prophecy believing Christian. He's not. He's not, and people have to totally get that out of their heads. If anybody believes that, I would ask them to show me a shred of evidence that that's the case. It's not. Now, I've always said that it doesn't really matter because Trump, unsaved, unbelieving Trump has been far better to Israel than born again Christian Sunday school teaching Jimmy Carter was.
That's true.
So sometimes we can't be this simplistic and just think somebody's a believer. In fact, some of the most anti-Israel people in American history have been born again Christians. I'm thinking of James Baker III, who was George Bush, the father's Secretary of State, who led Bible studies, all that stuff, but very anti-Israel, replacement theologist. So Trump's not a believer, and he doesn't have a believer's view of why this Middle East conflict exists. If somebody asks you or me, Steve, Brett, why does the Middle East conflict exist? You and I are going to immediately say it's spiritual.
Yeah.
God said, thus it will be with Israel in the latter day. And the enemy said, no, I'm rebelling against it. And the enemy's mouthpiece and agency for all this is modern day Islamic, fundamentalism.
Yeah.
But Trump doesn't see this spiritually. He doesn't have that discernment, and we shouldn't impute to him that discernment. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So he's a strategist, and he may be sympathetic. You don't have to be a born again Christian to support Israel. He definitely, I'm sure, sees Israel as the good side, the good guy in the Middle East conflict. I'm not negating any of that, but what that interview confirmed was what I always knew, and that is, don't think Trump approaches this conflict as somebody who's a premillennial, guy, believes in end time eschatology like we do. Okay. He's got his own secular view of it, and he has a daughter who converted to Judaism.
Yeah.
I'm sure that plays part of it. Okay. But he also has a son-in-law who's Lebanese. And that, by the way, played a role in his negotiating a truce between Israel and Hezbollah. Remember, Trump is also a very transactional person. Rub my back, I'll rub your back. That's why the whole airplane gift by guitar looked bad, because they're like, what is this, a transactional thing? What are they expecting? And I know you wanted to ask me about that down the road, but I'm just saying, so, I took so many
Yeah.
curves in
Oh,
this
that's
answer. I
great.
forget what you asked me. So yes, on those three things, no, Israel was not betrayed. Yes, it's the art of the deal, but he is circumventing Netanyahu. And now I remember that's what got me into this whole thing with the book, called
Yeah.
Trump's Peace,
Yeah.
because he doesn't like Netanyahu. And if any of your people watching this challenge me and say, but Steve, we saw the video footage of how Bibi was received at the White House with unprecedented pomp and circumstance. How not only the red carpet, and Trump met him at the limousine, but then every single member of the cabinet was in a line to shake hands with Bibi. Of course, all that happened because it was meant to, it was sort of to show the opposite of what Biden did. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And remember, Netanyahu is the figurehead of the state of Israel. So it's also showing respect to Israel and treating Netanyahu like an honored guest like that. But it doesn't take away what I told you about that interview a few years ago, that Trump does not like Netanyahu. And therefore, I'm not surprised that he has circumvented him in every one of these decisions. And I'm going to just quickly list them for you, all four of these decisions that he circumvented. The release of the hostage, Adon Alexander, a
Yeah.
few days ago, done behind Israel's back and behind Netanyahu's back. The Houthi thing we've already mentioned. The Saudi Arabia arms deal happening without Israel because the Saudis demand that Israel recognize a future Palestinian state, and Israel refuses to do that. And I'm glad Israel refuses to do that. I'm happy that Israel won't even pay lip service to a Palestinian state. Okay, so I'm all for it, but that's what Saudi Arabia demanded, and Trump decided that he's all right. Israel's not playing ball or won't give, Saudi Arabia what they want, so I'll give them half of what they want. I'll give them a $145 billion arms deal, the largest arms deal in history. Okay, I think in any arms
It's
deal of the
giant.
United States in history,
Yeah.
but excluding the so-called nuclear cover. Okay, I don't believe that there was part of the deal, because such a deal that would bring, what is that nuclear deal? To allow Saudi Arabia to pursue, a peaceful nuclear program, and also bring Saudi Arabia under America's nuclear umbrella. All those things would require American Congress to vote on. And they don't think they have the votes for it because Congress is still believing that Israel should be part of the deal, that Saudi Arabia shouldn't get awarded fully like that unless it expands and includes itself in the Abraham Accords. So that's number three. The fourth thing, the negotiation of this nuclear deal with Iran. And all of this. Oh, and the fifth thing, and maybe the biggest thing, negotiating the end to the war in Gaza without Israel being involved. Now, Israel's the main party to the war, and they're not being consulted on all these wheeling and dealings. Trump is, Trump's guy, Witkoff, is negotiating a permanent end to the war. And this is America doing all the negotiating. Israel's
Yeah.
not even being included in all
Would
this. So
you
five
say
major
I got a
circumvents.
sixth?
Yes.
What about the meeting with Syrian President Al Jolani? Like
Love,
that's number six,
love.
right?
You got it again. You got it. I love it. And let's see if we'll get to 7, 8, 9.
Yeah.
You're right. The Syrian thing.
Yeah.
The Syrian
That's
thing, which
giant.
came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Right. Came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So yes. So is it a betrayal of Israel? No. Could you argue it's a betrayal of Netanyahu personally? Yes. But if one studies the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump and is willing to look behind, the optics and behind the pomp and circumstance of the last couple of visits of Netanyahu, there's enough out there in the public record that he does not like Netanyahu and he does not trust him personally.
I'm a
Now,
little shocked
is that
by that.
Netanyahu's fault? Am I blaming Netanyahu for that? No. This isn't me piling on Netanyahu here. I'm just saying, but that's what Trump really thinks about
Wow.
it. Whether that's good or bad or whether it was earned or not.
Now, on the first round of Abraham Accords in his first presidency, one of the things that I perceived, maybe I'll get this wrong, but I perceived that Trump brilliantly bailed on the whole two-state solution and kind of said, forget the Palestinians. And he sort of focused on Israel and what Israel could do for other nations economically.
Right.
Um, and I loved that he was like one of the first politicians that actually said, forget the two-state solution. Nobody wants that.
Right.
But now I perceive that somewhere he's hearing, and maybe the civil war you're talking about is whispering in his ear to his offside.
I agree with you.
Do you think that's why he seems to be flipping?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let's say this. If not, flipping's a little too hard because he hasn't landed on a decision yet. So I won't say that he's flipped, but he's definitely, if you remember in these, cartoons or movies where these two little devils, one on each shoulder,
Yeah.
whispering to each ear, that's the stage I think he's currently in and just hasn't arrived to a conclusion yet. I think it would be a huge mistake. The Israeli public itself is very much against it. Um, I'm very much against the two-state solution, personally, and I know that most Israelis agree with me on this. So, but yeah, I think it's because of the civil war happening within his administration. Right. It's true that the current Trump administration has more believers, than previous ones. Let's say this. I take that back because the other Jimmy Carter's and,
Yeah.
Condoleezza Rice, and George Bush the son, all these people claim to be believers in their cabinets. But this was the first cabinet where you have believers aligned with not replacement theology, who see that Israel really is important in prophecy. Who are those people? Huckabee is the ambassador, but with all fairness, and I know him personally, and he won't take this as an insult that I'm telling you, but that doesn't put him at the top of decision making, and Mike Huckabee himself said that he only takes orders, that he's going to execute the will of the Trump administration. It's not like he's not going to make the policy. So we'll have to remove him for a minute. I'm not saying that he's not important at all, but he's one of the two examples that I was going to list. But
Yeah.
in the pecking order of power in the Trump administration, I wouldn't put Mike Huckabee, in the top 5, 6, 7 people that have Trump's ear. And if he's watching, which I doubt he is, he knows that I'm not saying that as an insult, because like I said, we love him and I know him personally. Pete Hegseth is probably the most senior ranking, believer with similar outlooks to us in terms of, Israel's role in prophecy. This is one of the reasons why Congress, so many people were so passionately against Hegseth being not, approved because they knew this. They knew this about Hegseth,
Yeah.
and they raised all these other rumors and issues about him and stuff like that. But behind a lot of this was Hegseth's, he was dismissed as a white nationalist, because he had a cross tattoo on his, but it all comes down to Hegseth's faith, in my opinion, which is why he was really the victim of vitriol. But even he sided with Trump that he should pursue diplomacy now. So even his star is aligned with the other stars. The problem is going to be when Trump decides that Iran's not playing ball. How will that civil war? How many of those people in Trump's cabinet are against war no matter what the circumstances are? I would say the one closest to that would be Tulsi Gabbard. Okay, Tulsi Gabbard, the head of the intelligence, coordination for the country. And I knew this, before she was appointed. In other words, I'd seen enough interviews with Tulsi Gabbard to know that. And by the way, I respect her, her service. She served, for something like 20 years, I think, in the American military. I only have respect for her. So what I'm saying now is not meant to be an insult to her. But I always knew she's on the side of no wars, avoid wars at all costs. Okay. The people who are in the iffy gray area, should the peace talks with Iran fail, are people like Hegseth, people like Marco Rubio, people like who all were on board with this diplomacy, but where will they be if diplomacy fails on that spectrum? With Tulsi Gabbard being the most anti-war of those people, where do they fit in on that spectrum? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is interesting. And I think it's something, as a Bible prophecy, reader and reading of the scriptures, these are things to watch. I think they're all shaping up to speak to perhaps the future of what the Bible actually says. And so that's why these things are really interesting to me. The meeting with the Syrian president Al Jilani, let's talk about that for a second. You
Yes,
and I have talked about that in previous sessions. And but I've always felt like this is a really dangerous situation in the north of Israel, and some people have blown that off as well. He's not going to do anything. He's just trying to survive now as the new president of Syria. Um, but I feel like he's playing a really smart game. He shaved his beard nice, and he's wearing a suit, and he's no longer an ISIS flag waving. But just not that long ago, we had a $10 million reward on his head as one of the worst
yeah,
terrorists in the world. And
that's
suddenly
right.
Trump's meeting with him, which, boy, when do we start meeting with terrorists? If I'm Israel, I would be seeing this as a very dangerous thing, especially, and maybe you can speak into this. The Islamic world doesn't have the same sense of honor when it comes to
That's
deals
right.
and shaking hands and agreements. How dangerous is this for Israel? And the Syrian thing, it just seems like a powder keg to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it is dangerous. In fact, of all the fronts that we've covered, the Houthis, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the nuclear thing, the Syria thing is up there with I would say up with Iran's nuclear program because it's a border country with Israel. Uh, no, I agree with you, and I'm glad you cited. Remember, he's an Islamic fundamentalist,
Yeah,
and fundamental to their view of war is something. I hope I remember. I'm saying this correct. Again, I'm speaking off the cuff here. It's called taqiyya. When you're allowed to lie to your
right.
enemy, to disarm them, and then once you have the advantage, go back on your word. That's right. That's allowed in Islamic warfare. So first of all, kudos to you for knowing that, and you hope there's people in the Trump administration that knows it, but I'm not sure there are.
And I hope so.
And yeah, so that's a problem. I agree with you. That is a problem. Now, I read today, even though Trump said he's going to roll back all the sanctions, that's not something you can just do with a snap of a finger. There's many layers to these sanctions, and many estimates say it would take months, for them to roll back these sanctions. So who knows what will happen in the meanwhile? But there's no doubt about it. This trip to the Middle East, this Trump trip has been filled with all sorts of surprises. The least of which now is that whole $400 million airplane. I would say
Yeah.
that's just like the icing on the cake.
Yeah.
So
What do you
yeah.
think Cutter's game is with the airplane, and what do you think that they want out of this whole thing?
Well, influence, and that's why I don't think Trump should have taken the plane. And I've heard his defense, I've heard all of his defense, and I don't buy any of it. It's horrible optics. Even if Trump were to say, "Well, I can't be bought," people know that. Nobody's going to buy me. I make my decisions, and all that may be true, but it's still awful optics. You have to remember something. Qatar is guilty of what the Jews are accused of. Everybody thinks it's the Jews who are the grand puppeteers that control American politics, education, all that stuff. But the truth is Qatar is probably single-handedly responsible for turning the entire American education system, at least, into the Marxist Islamist, seminary system that it's become. What does America's education system crank out today? Nothing but Marxists
Yeah.
and Islamists. And where does that come from? Qatar donates billions and billions and billions of dollars to American universities, and they fund the chairs, and they decide, therefore, the professors that will fill these chairs, and they're the ones playing the long game here. Qatar has done many things. I only name the education thing, but they've also, I personally, I can't prove it, but I won't mention names because, I don't want to get sued. Not that I haven't, it's funny, so anybody sued me, all they'd get is my coffee because that's all I currently worth is my coffee as an unemployed tour guide here. But, I do think there are some very famous podcasters who have been bought off by Qatar. I don't think that they're supportive the Arabs and Qatar for nothing. I think that some of them have been bought off. And then you have Al Jazeera, which is one of the main opinion makers of the Arab world. So, oh, and by the way, they fund the Muslim Brotherhood, they fund Hamas. There's no doubt that if Qatar wanted to free all the Israeli hostages, they'd be free tomorrow because Qatar played a huge role in the freeing of this guy, Idan Alexander, a few days ago. So yeah, I think it's bad optics. At the minimal, it's bad
Yeah.
optics. And the plane's not even worth much because for it to be used and integrated as an Air Force One, I heard yesterday that they would have to disassemble the plane by part to make sure there's nothing in there that's booby trapped, no listening devices. It wouldn't even be ready by the end of the Trump,
Yeah.
administration. And it's possible that
It's 400 million just to rebuild the plane, or
right.
something
So
like
I,
that.
I thought it was bad optics,
I agree.
and I don't think he should have accepted it.
I mean,
Yes.
taking a note from Israel and the pagers and walkie-talkies, can you imagine what a plane could hold?
Oh,
If they made the hull out of C4 or something, it just seems like just even the optics, let alone the possible espionage surveillance problems of having a plane given by Qatar. But
Qatar is a bad, bad
yeah,
actor in the world. And another thing,
I
Brett,
wouldn't
if I can
trust
just
them.
add, and this too wasn't good optics. Now, I would want to read a little bit deeper into this, but I don't think it's just a rumor. This whole thing about a I think one of Trump's sons has made a deal for like a multi-billion-dollar golf course in one of these, states, maybe even related to Qatar. So, I mean, yeah, of course it's going to raise people's, looks and say, well, what's that about? And is this appropriate for a sitting president,
Yeah,
even for his son to be involved in these type of business deals? And I think these are legitimate questions. And again, I vote just like I said with Netanyahu. I voted for Trump in 2016. I voted for Trump in this last election, but I'm not, I don't worship politicians. I don't feel as believers we had to extend what the Romans extended to their tribunes called sacrosanctity.
yeah.
Right. Trump is not sacrosanct. He's not above criticism when it's said in good faith as we're leveling it right now. Nobody can accuse me of being, an anti-Trumper, or a
Oh, they
Trump
will.
delusion, right? But of course there's things that are questionable.
Yeah,
The plane and the son making a multi-billion-dollar deal for a Trump hotel and golf course in one of these countries. Of course, it's not good optics at the least, and you wonder if it's going to lead to favors, in the future. Of course,
yeah. Yeah, well, there's out of our list of things here, there's one thing we haven't really tapped into. Just an update.
yes.
What do you see? I mean, with the Gaza war, and where it seems like our Trump administration has sort of turns its posture even on that, and Netanyahu is saying, no, we're going in and ramping things up. What do you see? With the hostages that are there, what's going to end that war? You some people say it's a complete annihilation of Hamas, and other people are saying, no, just get the hostages out and then let the Palestinians live there. It seems really misguided in a lot of ways. What do you see with Gaza right now?
All right, so I'll tell you at least what they're claiming are the Trump parameters for ending the war.
Yeah,
Okay. And it's really largely based on the Egyptian parameters for ending the war, which is that Hamas has to agree to disarm, but it will be allowed to participate in a future Palestinian government, both in the government as well as the police force. Now, that to me is already,
yeah,
man,
that's already a
now
problem.
Israel's totally against that. And I agree with Israel. But I side with Israel on this issue. Okay. I think they're totally right on this. So, in return, all the hostages would be given back. The war would end. There'd be a long term, they don't give the exact number, but in Islam, it's usually 10 years, what they call a hudna, a temporary ceasefire for 10 years. I think one of the things that Trump has offered them is Israel will not be allowed to assassinate Hamas's leaders during that time. Okay, so that's another giveaway. And of course, Israel's against this because of Hamas's participation. Now, the good news is that Hamas currently refuses under any circumstance to disarm. So it may not even ever get to that
Yeah,
point. But let's say Hamas agreed to disarm, well, then we would have a real problem because it looks like Trump is offering, and again, I'm not saying that this has all been officially printed. These are, from leaks that that have been leaked to the press. That, and by the way, this is based on three people, okay, Arabs and an American administration person, okay, based on what I'm telling you. That this is what they've been offered, right? That they disarm, but they'll be allowed to participate in the government. A PA, a Palestinian Authority government, is like a minority partner. Participation in the PA police is a minority partner, and Israel not allowed to assassinate Hamas's leaders, in the aftermath of the ceasefire. That's the deal. Now, Israel, it's up to Hamas whether they're willing to disarm, and I don't think they are. So far, they've totally refused to do that. And therefore, Israel seems to be bent on launching what's called Operation Gideon's Chariots. I'm going by I've only seen this term in Hebrew. I don't, I assume it's called Merkavot Gidon. Okay. If you translate that to English, it's Gideon's Chariots. Okay. Which would be a massive escalation in the war. It would be fought very differently than the war was fought heretofore, which is in the previous war, Israel would destroy a place and then withdraw from the place. And then in the cases of Shifa Hospital, okay, there were two battles. The first Shifa battle, to take the hospital, kill some of the terrorists, but then they withdrew and the terrorists reconstituted themselves there a few months later for a second battle.
Yeah.
None of the previous war, by the way, was fought underground. It's true that they dropped bunker busting bombs that destroyed tunnels to the extent that they knew where these tunnels were, but it's not like Israel was fighting tactically, what you would call cleaning a house or sweeping a house, but underground. Now, that's how this war will be different. Okay, now Israel will fight to seize territory, keep the territory, and fight battles even in the tunnels below. With the goal I almost said permanently, but it's possible. Okay, to reoccupy Gaza and to now go back to being an occupying force of the Gaza Strip as it was before the year 2005 when Sharon withdrew from Gaza. The only problem with that is that, and this is where, Bibi unfortunately has a lot of difficulties in his coalition. You have a group of very zealous religious Jews, settler types that want to include the reestablishment of Jewish settlements in Gaza, which by myself, I'm totally against. I'm against, as long as there is a significant Gaza population living there, then I'm against resettling Israeli citizens there. And if I can just tell you why, because I'm not sure people know this, the whole reason why Sharon withdrew from Gaza was because in those days you had something like 7,000 Israeli, what they call settlers, living among 2 million Palestinians, and it required, for every one of those settlers, it required a few Israeli soldiers as bodyguards. It removed too many Israeli soldiers from being able to practice for war. And therefore, when the war with Hezbollah happened in 2006, Israel was not prepared for that war, largely or partly because of its being bodyguards for Jewish, all the army being commandeered to protect Jewish settlers in the Gaza Strip. So it was not considered practical. It still wouldn't be practical. And therefore, this is where Netanyahu is going to have problems with his own coalition, because they're going to insist that when Israel takes over the Gaza Strip, that they resettle it, with Jewish settlers and reestablish these Jewish towns, which would be totally insane.
You'd have to be a little crazy if you asked me to be a Jew willing to go. Now, I know there's people that will do that, but that just seems like a horrible way to live.
So you'll appreciate this story. Just a couple weeks before that withdrawal back in 2005, our mutual friend, Phil Millier, who was, Applegate's guy, roaming reporter there, Phil was invited to go on a media tour of the Gaza Strip on the eve of the pullout, pulling the Jews out. And he asked me, Steve, do you want to go with me? The Gaza Strip until that point was the only place I had never been to, even as an Israeli soldier. I had been to Lebanon as an Israeli soldier. I'd been to the West Bank as an Israeli soldier, but I'd never been to the Gaza Strip, even as a soldier. So I jumped at the opportunity. I said, you bet. So Phil and I are on a bus, and I'll never forget this. We're driving on a bus to these Jewish towns, and right next to one of the Jewish towns, not even hundreds of yards away, but literally on the other side of the street, this Palestinian village with Hezbollah flags, Hamas flags. Like, you literally felt, I don't know how any of these people felt any security there. It looked like the most insecure place to live. The community was nice. It had American-style homes, American-style sidewalks, a swimming pool. I remember one of the first people that one of the first people that Phil and I interviewed, because I was Phil's translator, was this woman in an equestrian style lunging ring, where these people lunge horses. Like you would think this was some like super nice valley in California, like the Napa Valley. But your next door neighbor is Hezbollah and Hamas. I don't know why these Gaza people had Hezbollah flags, but they had Hezbollah flags in addition to Hamas. And I remember being very impressed at that moment that no way should these settlements stay there. I could see why Sharon wanted to pull away from there. And Sharon was not some left-winger. He was not some dove. He was one of the most right-wing Israeli politicians in history, but he realized it was no longer feasible to stay there. And it's still not feasible to ever live there as long as the Palestinians live there.
Do you see a danger in the worldview of, Hamas is obviously the radical, murderous, butchering kind of people. But with that, next to the Palestinian Authority, everybody, I think, has been lulled into this worldview that the PA is peace loving and they're wonderful people who are going to be great to live next to Israel. But you and I both know there's not that much distance between the PA and the Hamas.
That's right.
As their worldview. So what do you think? What do you think is the solution? Because they're all talking about we'll put them in authority since the Hamas will be gone. We'll put them in the authority.
So look, I'm against it, and Israel's against it. But it's possible that this is what America's pursuing.
Yeah.
So what's the difference? Okay, the difference is the PLO or PA is a secular body, whereas Hamas is an Islamist Muslim Brotherhood body. But both of their charters have destroying Israel as their goal. Now, what's interesting about the Palestinian Authority Charter, the PLO Charter, and this is why Israel was so stupid with a capital S and pursuing this Oslo peace process back in the 90s, because central to the PA view of destroying Israel is called destroying Israel in stages. And central to that PLO stratagem is we're to gain a piece of territory, and from that piece of territory launch to get the next piece of territory. And then once we get that piece of territory, this is what they mean by destroying Israel in stages. So what does stupid Israel do? And I'm saying this is a proud Jew. What did the stupid Jews, and I'm saying this is a proud Jew, folks. Nobody accuse me of being an anti-Semite here. But boy, on the one hand, some of the brightest people on the planet. On the other hand, some of the most foolish people on the planet. So what did the foolish Jews do in the 1990s? Knowing the whole thing of destroying Israel in stages is the plan of the PLO, and invited the PLO to set up a state in the heart of Israel in the West Bank, which the PLO saw as the beginning of their destroying Israel in stages. And I'll never forget the next day when Yasser Arafat goes to South Africa, and some other Muslims yell out to him in Arabic, "Wallah, Yasser, what are you doing making peace with the Jews?" And all this stuff. He basically said to them in Arabic. He said two things to them. He said Hudaybiyah in Arabic, which is referring to when Muhammad made a false peace with the people in Mecca for 10 years and then went back to destroy them 2 years later, or 2 or 3 years later when they were vulnerable for it. We talked about this earlier in this discussion, with Taqiyya being the name of, when you can lie, okay? And then he referred to this whole thing of destroying Israel in stages. In other words, so he didn't betray the Palestinian cause at all. he didn't betray the PLO charter at all with this Oslo peace
Yeah.
accords. But the Jews, they fell for it. And to this day, you have the PA, in the middle of Judea and Samaria. And this is who they now want to replicate in Gaza. So no, I think it's a mistake, and most Israelis are against it. And like I said, it's a shame if somebody has Trump's ear now, pushing that whole, let's put the
Two
PA there,
states.
because that was the Biden plan.
Yeah.
That's exactly what the Biden plan was.
Yeah. Well, is there, man, an hour goes by quickly. Is there anything we haven't covered that's been on your heart that we need to cover, or do you think we tackled it pretty well?
No, I think this was, as usual, you and I always have thorough discussions. I think we didn't leave any open ends here.
Yeah.
So, and hopefully everybody will enjoy it, and, leave comments. I know eventually you put it on YouTube. So I'd love to hear where people disagree,
Yeah.
with anything that I've said. And sometimes I engage with those comments.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and to remember, if anybody wants to keep up with any of my own stuff on my own YouTube channel, Steve the Tour Guide.
Yeah, there's some great stuff on there. And one of these days, you and I are going to have to talk about the Gog-Magog war. Is it Armageddon or is it not? Because we have different views on that. But yeah, I can see your view. It'd be worth people checking that out on your Steve the Tour Guide YouTube channel.
Well, I appreciate that. I've always appreciated that about you, right? That you're always open to other views.
Yeah, no, and that's the way you learn stuff. So it's been great. I sure appreciate you, Steve, and man, we'll have to do this again soon.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Brett. Thanks for having me, Athey Creek, and wishing you all a phenomenal weekend.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Well, that is always a great time talking with Steve. I really appreciate his perspective on some of these things, and it brings a lot of the questions I had about this Trump visit to help me understand a little bit what's going on. But, one thing I was reading just recently in the Psalm chapter 2, it says, "Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath and vex them with his sore displeasure." One of the things I was thinking about that, while we see Trump visiting all these big state leaders and, world powers and making deals and all that stuff, one thing we need to remember is not only is the Lord seated upon the throne, he is the ruler and the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So we all need to remember to take all these world leaders with a grain of salt and just realize that God's got a plan and a purpose, and his purpose is going to unfold. When we talk about these things, it's just part of, some of you might be new to Bible prophecy. You wonder, why are they talking about Israel and Saudi Arabia and, Golani up in the, Syria and all these guys? The answer is the Bible says we can watch and be sober, be vigilant about what's going on around the world. But I like this Psalm chapter 2. It says, why do the heathen rage? Everybody freaks out about everything. But God, it says here, sits in heavens and he shall laugh. Do you ever wonder if God's just there laughing at what is happening when we make our deals and our peace treaties and, these nations say where they're going to annihilate the Israel and the Jews? God is just seated upon the throne, and I think he's laughing, Psalm chapter 2. So we can just know that God's in control. He's not perturbed. He's not upset. So you and I should not be perturbed or upset. When Steve and I talk about these things, one thing we remember is all these things are falling in place the way the Bible sort of tells us this is the way it's going to come down. And we're seeing those things right before our eyes, a lot of these things unfolding about the nations gathering against Israel. The anti-Semitism we're seeing around the world, they're all fulfillments of Bible prophecy, and we're seeing that as we get closer to the end. So as Christians, we should be joyful, we should rejoice, we should also present the gospel that we're all sinners doomed for destruction, but man, the Lord loves us so much that he gave his only begotten Son to die on the cross for the sins of the world. And if you believe in him and accept the work of salvation for the sins, that you repent in your heart, say, I'm repentant, I changed my mind, and I want to follow the Lord, the Bible says you will be saved. Romans 10:9 and 10. If you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart the Lord Jesus, that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So there it is, a little prophecy update addendum. I just thought it'd be good for us to talk about some of the things because Middle East is stirring as Trump is finalizing the rest of his visit there. But we'll see. We'll see what happens, and we'll keep our eyes on Jesus. So may the Lord bless you, and we'll see you the first Friday of the month of June for our next prophecy update. God bless you.